Namaskar and welcome to this exciting new episode of Sathology Debunking Mythology. We have a very special guest from all the way from Singapore. All the way. It's night time over there, and he has done amazing work, very popular on social media, very well connected, and he's one of the works in bringing the stolen deities back to India. One of them was my touched my heart, and he has been consistently delivering. And his another brilliant idea which he works on, datareveals.org, must go and visit, and you'll see amazing insights over there. So technologically connected to the culture, and it is going to appeal to many of you who run Sathology clubs, because that's what we are all about: debunking mythology, the renouncing the fake history which has been told to us and through the colonial master, faith-based colonials. So without delay, let us welcome Sri Anurag Saxena from Singapore.
Namaskar, Satsangi ji. Pleasure to
Namaskar.
be here as always.
Namaskar, namaskar. So it's datareveals.org. I have been going there. What a fantastic analysis you have done, and I think it's going to grow much uh, longer as it goes. Like now it just started. What do you have to say on that? Where the inspiration came from?
Well, you see, I think once you get slapped around enough, the inspiration comes in from within. For most of us, perhaps all of us who come in from India, we've lived in a world where there are very wilted and lopsided and misinformed views about India. I remember end of last century, for example, when I was in the US doing my MBA. It was a top 10 B school and all of that. But uh, I actually had classmates and group mates that would ask me if I owned a pet elephant that took me to school. You see, now, the frustration started then, that the world tends to have a very warped view of India, of Indian people, of Indian culture, of Indian faith, of Indian politics, of Indian society, etc., etc. People don't think twice before they call India the rape capital of the world. You watch Slumdog Millionaire and Salam Bombay, you will think that India is the filthiest country where people are getting their children kidnapped left, right, and center. Right? You read certain newspapers, and you will. It's very easy for you to imagine that nobody in India has the freedom to speak, while the reality is that there are people in Delhi who day in and day out are making a living out of abusing a democratically elected prime minister, right? But then the narrative is that there is no freedom of speech in India. So there was a lot of I wouldn't say anti-India narratives, but there were a lot of narratives which were not being challenged enough, which were showing my culture, my nation in a bad light. So we just said, listen, this needs a logical, factual response. So data reveals very simply is a public utility. It's a free service for anybody that wants to use it, where we will take a media narrative and just empirically test it. So, for example, if a media narrative says that India is the rape capital of the world, now while I agree that even one rape is hugely reprehensible, we having said that, we need to understand that the way women are treated is a patriarchy problem. It's a gender problem. It's a power problem. It's a problem of one gender forcing itself over the other, not an India problem or an Asia problem. So if somebody goes and makes a claim that India is the rape capital of the world, we will just go out to official government sources from India, from Australia, from US, UK, wherever, and we will just tell you what the data reveals. Period. It could show India in a great light. It could show India in a terrible light. It could show Thailand in a great light, terrible light. USA in so we're not here to set a narrative or build it. We're just here to bust the myths, and which is why an effort like Sathology is also very important. Right? We need to bust all these myths that are being built without anyone questioning them. So, long story short, all that data reveals does is we empirically test a media narrative for its truthfulness based on publicly available, credible government data. So, data from the government, data from the United Nations, World Bank, and things like that. hopefully over time we'll be able to, with enough of people joining this movement, we will be able to showcase journalists, if not as biased, at least some journalists, if not as biased, at least as lazy. And we are on a mission to root out this lazy journalism, where people start with a conclusion in mind and then work backwards to prove
Most of the journalists are actors, so nowadays it's more of an acting presentation. Like, whether you do it on as an actor or formally, or you do as a newscaster, most of them is acting, and they work on
it. Absolutely.
predetermined scripts. And we have seen that journalism as was is not existing. Very few people are left nowadays. Gopi Krishnan in India is one example, and Tucker Carlson is some example in the US. Very few are left. Now, coming back to what you said, there is a big misconception in the US where they refer to India as South Asia, where ideally it should be called rest of the Asia other than West Asia is India. The entire culture is common across everywhere. Whether you go to China, you go to Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Singapore, and all these places, Chola kings had conquered, ruled, and established trade routes. It's the history. But unfortunately, there is a saying in America which says the duck which quacks the loudest gets the cracker. We have not been quacking enough, or quacking loud enough, or quacking in the right way, in a direction sense. So how do you think that can change? Because in India, a little bit a politician says something good about India, is called marketing. But in the West, is hungry for that little bite. What do you want to say on that little bit, and then we'll move on.
So I think it's a very interesting question, Aditya, and I think there are two, three different layers to it that I would like to deconstruct. One, the bundling of India as South Asia. You see, there is this. I hope I'm getting the pronunciation right, because English is both our second language. So sorry if I'm getting the name wrong, but I think it's called the Velarypillis Circle. It's a circle which starts around Singapore, 6 hour of a flight radius. It's a small circle which covers 10% of the surface of the earth, but 50% of the population lives within this circle. This includes South China, this includes all of Indonesia, this includes all of India, obviously Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Myanmar, etc., etc. But think about this: 10% of the surface area is inhabited by 50% of the people, right? Unfortunately, the very limited capability of some scholars and some journalists, especially in the West, tend to club this 50% of the world together, or 25% of the world together, which in my mind is some kind of ism. So, as an example, if you have your viewers in the US, they should feel offended if I call them Latin American. Exactly as Latin America, as a Peruvian or an Argentinian or whoever, should feel offended if I call him American or Canadian, right? But unfortunately, there was a very condescending joke. I hate saying this, but some of my friends in the US used to crack it. They used to say, three languages trilingual, two languages bilingual, one language American, right? So unfortunately, the US has not bothered in investing in a worldview which is up to date, which is robust, which is fair, very simply. I think India needs to start calling itself out and demanding the identity and the recognition that it deserves, without being bundled with its neighbors, or without being labeled as a part of some other clique. Second, I think there is, you see, let's be very clear, right? I mean, let's not go rara over the countries or the country that we both come from. The reality is that the US and most nations in Western Europe have been very successful at exporting the idea of their grandness, or exporting the idea of their success. Right now, America did it by exporting the idea of their entertainment, through Hollywood and all of that. So the world consumes America's idea of entertainment. Um, Germany exported their idea of productivity, of efficiency, of machinery, of manufacturing. Right. France exported its idea of culture, of food, right? The UK exported its idea of governance, things like so. Each of these countries in the past have created their space in the world through exporting the idea of something. It's only now that India has started even recognizing what we are about. There is now, under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, who's very proudly who's very proudly Indian from the inside, right? You see, I'm very comfortable wearing a kurta today. Many of my colleagues are. I don't think I was 10, 20 years back. Um, so I think what's happening now is India has started claiming uh, its own identity internally, and slowly we will start claiming our identity internally. Now I don't know what that idea is that we export, uh, right? So and that's something that needs to be debated on a wider platform. But nations do emerge as powerful only when there is a core idea that the world is able to absorb from them. And I think India has only very recently started understanding what that idea is ourselves.
You brought some very good points, and one thing I'll give it to the credit of India, and maybe because of the ancient culture of India, is that any idea in the world is sustained in India. Like, for example, colonialism or imperialism of the British was finally given a boost after it came to India because the India sustained it. The biggest American political export has been democracy, and India is the world's largest democracy. When communism was popular, the biggest market for communism was again India. So
Correct.
communism, democracy, or you call it classical liberalism of Europe, that's how the left flourishes. Karl Marx, all these philosophy plus many other Middle Eastern and other Chinese philosophies are sustained in India. Their
Absolutely.
philosophy, India absorbs everybody, and at the same time, it becomes a master in that. It's a big sponge, and then they start exporting it back again. It's time for India to export their own philosophy also, like uh,
Absolutely.
like
Yeah.
Jeffrey Armstrong said, "Dharmocracy," and he said it, and Ram Madhav repeated it again, and it's again a thing which we have to start exporting. So, what do you think India should export now? Because everyone is looking for some philosophy now.
You see, I think in my view, a couple of the models India could explore, right? One, India is the largest democracy, and despite, as an example, the per capita GDP of America is 35 times that of India. But as the events of 6th January have shown, India is a far more robust democracy where even the unwashed and uncouth masses, as the Western world likes to look at us, even they are happy to depend on elections results. Even they are happy, to have peaceful transitions of power, etc., etc. Right. So there is something to be said about a superior, woke, acceptable form of democracy. It could be democracy, which India wants to export. Second, another interesting idea that I'd like to see us explore a little more. You see, communism globally has failed, right? Except for maybe Kerala and West Bengal, I don't see any country that has flourished or people have flourished because of communism. So that is dead. On the other hand, if you look at capitalism also to a very large extent, I won't say capitalism is dead, but capitalism is pointless for the other 99%. And the US is a great example. There was this amazing book, I think it's about 15, 20 years old. The book is called Nickeled and Dimed, where the author went and lived her life on minimum wage jobs. She decided that she will not use her bank account, touch it, etc., etc. And it is today virtually impossible in the US if you're the bottom 50% of population. It is impossible in the US to afford two hot meals a day, get enough nutrition, spend enough time with the family, enrich yourself, send your kids to school, and make them prosper in life. I mean, these should be basic human rights. But half of America is not able to afford it today. They have to live off dole. They have to hold down multiple jobs. They have to trade off either health for convenience or education, or one of these things, right? So to super summarize, I think, communism has already failed. Capitalism is failing, other than the people who can afford their house in, San Diego or the Hamptons or wherever it is, right? I think there is an opportunity for India to present its own economic model, which is rooted in the idea of virtue, which is rooted in the idea of value creation, and in the idea of value distribution, right? So capitalism was only about value creation for yourself. Communism was about value distribution without creating it, right? So capitalism said, let's create value, let's not distribute it. Communism said, we don't have to create value, we just have to distribute whatever little we have, right? Now, historically, if you look at whether it's the Arthashastra or any of our ancient texts, right, enterprise has been about Riddhi Siddhi, which is creating and generating prosperity. Enterprise has also been about Punya Kamana, which is ostensibly, earning, let's say like what carbon credits are nowadays. So I think we have to kind of marry these together, which was historically the Indian idea of prosperity, the Indian idea of business, the Indian idea of economics. And I think the world is finally ready to buy into something like this. Especially when we talk of ideas like universal basic income, especially when we talk about job replenishment rates because of automation and AI and all of that. All of us, for example, have seen the video of robots in the Amazon packaging, the Amazon warehouse, etc. We're talking about tons of jobs that are getting replaced. So what happens in a world where everyone does not have a job? How do you then create value and distribute it? Existing economic models do not have enough of an intel or an idea how to do that. So I would hope, I call it dharmikism, but we can call it anything. But the idea of driving sustainable value creation um, for society at large, right? I think it's time to explore that idea, and people are doing it. There's conscious capitalism and there's green capitalism, and all of that. Sustainable agriculture, and people are talking about it in bits and pieces. It's time to focus on a composite and say, hey, what do we need so the world can sustain 9 billion people that we are going to be? You know.
See, the Indian, great Indian scriptures and history books, I would say, like Mahabharata, they bring out the concept of Loktantra and Lok Sangraha, the purpose
Uh-huh.
of everything in the governance. And that is an age old concept. Loktantra is not new, it's not a literal translation of democracy, because some people call democracy as demon crazy also. And we can see that in today's the 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 country which exported democracy cannot sustain it, because the powerful rich people have taken over. Now these
Yep.
people, they don't care about the majority. Like the forced vaccination was never heard of in the USA. The forced vaccines which are not tested were not never heard of, but they are being
Mhm.
implemented. They learn nothing like North Korean dictator asking his people that everyone should be euthanized, or everyone should be neutered, so that nobody can produce any children. It's as good as that, as good as that. Now we have seen those things happening right in front of our eyes, and especially our generation. We have seen the
Mhm.
91 Soviet collapse. We have seen the Gulf War one, two, three. We have seen so many events,
Sure.
which could not be seen in any other generation. We have seen, or maybe all generations have seen something. Some generations have seen World War One and two as well. So
We
the
are we are the chosen generation, Adityaji.
chosen generation, and we are
And
also seeing India's rise. See, one
yes.
of the important concepts I mentioned in my second book, also Narad, the Making of a Statesman, where the Narad says the Sanya Shakti is important to spread the good values or dharma in the society or defeat adharma.
Mhm.
India has just started realizing it. Like on the ground, they challenge China, and now they're, for the first time in the world, it's a big shock for plain sailors all over the world that India is inducting their own inbuilt fighter jet. So, what do you have to say on that a little bit? Because you are seeing it from Singapore point of view.
Well, you see, it's interesting. Look, I totally agree. To quote a old American saying, if you have them by their balls, their hearts and minds will follow. And I think we've been seeing this all over the world. Righteousness and this and that is fine, but there are people whose or there are nations, let's say, whose competence is limited by the use and the sight of force. Very similar to what you just said, I'd like to kind of quote and recommend, my friend Gautam Chikarmane, who's with the Observer Research Foundation. He has this fabulous idea of India finally becoming a Rajasic state. So India has finally reached so not so forget tamas and all of that, but we've reached a stage where deal we will recognize that there is an inherent energy, there is an inherent passion, there is an inherent force, that we have the ability to use our energy rather than kind of stay behind the curtain of Gandhian wokeness. So, as I call it. And look, it is only inevitable because India cannot say that we will not engage with the world in a language they don't understand. Right? It's not enough that you and I understand Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Right? The world need to understand. If they refuse to, then then India will have to talk a different language.
So one of the what I see here in there's a big in the tech world. I know you understand very well that tech world is also runs in movements. There's a movement for everything, and currently Americans have sold the whole world about AI. Not American generally, IBM. And I'm nothing against to say, but when I used to be in the industry, I used to call them I have been misled, and that was the old, that's the term I used to use a lot for IBM. And they are trying to sell this unique idea about AI, but the concept of AI is in every single plant which doesn't move, is still growing. It's a very natural phenomena. AI. There is also AI because you cannot perceive it moving, but it is growing. It's producing fruits. It is. You can call it life or whatever you call it. Maybe less conscious part of life. The
Mhm.
the another downside of AI, which you initially mentioned, that you have robots delivering everything, but there is also another movement going to. Now this is for all the lazy people who cannot grow the food and who cannot work on the land, and they just want to buy the consumers. For consumers and big corporations, AI is perfect because they order something on Amazon, gets delivered yes tomorrow at 9 a.m. Now for the rest of the people, and I'm even talking about rich people, the biggest farmland owner in the world is in the USA is who? Microsoft chairman Bill Gates. Why is he buying the farmland for? I know he has his own designs of creating artificial chip based food maybe, but the guy, the richest, who is running the biggest AI firm in the world, Microsoft, is the single biggest AI firm, bigger than China, and they are growing food, and they are talking about agriculture. They are talking about living on the land. His wife spends half the year in Jharkhand and Bihar, half the year Ayodhya. That's where they spend their life in the villages. So their personal life is going towards organic lifestyle, but they're preaching to the whole world that buy their technology so that they can continue their passion. So, what do you think is the real future of the AI? Because you are seeing from Singapore, which is another hub of AI right now, in that part of the
You
world.
see, it is very interesting. No, in fact, I have a lot of respect for the model Singapore adopts to ensure that they quickly become, they quickly get ahead of the pack. It could be biotechnology, it could be artificial intelligence, it could be digital media, a whole bunch of areas. Um, I'm not a big fan of normative statements, which basically means, here is how things should be. Let's leave that to the protesters of JNU who keep talking about their view of an ideal world. Um, if I were to leave normative statements aside, reality is, just from the way the stock markets work, just from the way companies are valued, just from the kind of goal sheets that CEOs and people under them are measured on, it is very likely that we will have more automation, we will need more predictability, etc., etc. I mean, I don't see why you can't wait 4 days for a pair of shoes you bought. I'm never in a hurry that I should get my pair of shoes or my ketchup bottle or whatever in 2 days' time. But apparently the world is, and it's only going to get faster. When that happens, there, when that happens, I don't know. I don't know what happens, to the 7 billion people now or the 8 billion people 40 years from now. I don't know what jobs they do. I don't know how they get fed. What happens to farmers once drones start planting seeds? Once canals and so-called smart pumps or smart sprinklers identify the humidity level in soil and start sprinkling water whenever is needed. What happens once you have automated robotic tractors who start cutting the crop and things like that? I think this is going to be this is the generation where we answer these existential questions. The reality is, if you look at the Nordic countries now, they already have lesser jobs than their population to a huge degree. And, there's pretty much an open acceptance to the fact that we will not be able to create jobs for everybody. So what do you then do for people that, as capable as they are, as willing that they are, what kind of jobs will they have, etc., etc.? And I think that's where, in a very weird way, the Indian model comes into play, which is, because of depravity, because of colonization and all of that, there is inbuilt inefficiency, which basically means we will need people to do jobs, and therefore they have salaries coming in slightly longer than the so-called Western world. So I think it will be interesting to see the implications of that.
See, when today there are many farms in India exporting food to the United States, which claim that their crops are produced from the hoofs of the bulls. So when the tractor were introduced, the bulls were sent to the slaughterhouse. It is a very well-known fact in America also. So
Mhm.
before, earlier, the horses and the bulls used to till the lands during the early railroad history of America also. And as soon as the tractors were invented, bulls were killed, and
Mhm.
somebody gets over. Now when the robots take over, and this is something which you can also put it out in your data reveals, actually, where we can see that
Sure.
that one. Same thing when the humans are put out of work, then they
Uh-huh.
just remain a tool in the hands of few people who control those technologies. Look what has
Mhm.
happened in Amazon. They deplatformized some people which they didn't want to, and the
Mhm.
Google and Apple apps, they also deplatformized people whom they didn't want. So it becomes a very authoritarian, goes against the human principle. So ultimately what I'm seeing is, which is also predicted in our Shastra also, that intelligent men will live in the forest, they'll run away from cities, because you are just making the human endeavor useless. And the
Mhm.
human itself is cutting the branch from the trunk by building or focusing on these technologies instead of focusing on the human potential or the purpose of the human life, these different
Yep.
aspects.
True.
See, you cannot, so it's a commodity. Human being is becoming commodity now. So what is your viewpoint on that, sir?
True. Sorry, before I get to this specific question, as you were speaking, I was reminded of another fact that we discovered in while doing work on data reveals. There's this Crop Care Federation of India that has been releasing some very interesting data. I don't know if you know this, but purely in terms of fertilizer and pesticides that are used, um, if you take if you take two columns or two metrics by country, the total amount of food grains that are produced. This includes coarse crops, fruits, vegetables, etc., etc. So if you just take the value of food production, and if you take the value of of what do they call it? Essentially, fertilizers, pesticides, etc., etc., crop protection chemicals, right? Agrochemicals. India is literally the most efficient in the world, right? So for I don't remember the number, but I think for every dollar of fertilizer use, India has produced some $5,800 worth of crops. For most other countries, that number is between 200 and 500. So yeah, you're right. I think the fact that India tends to retain some of its ancient wisdom, and the fact that India tends to be a little more sustainable with its agriculture is very, very interesting. I mean, these are again concepts or ideas that we could export, especially now when there is a premium for food. For example, I'm sure if you shop at Whole Foods, an apple at Whole Foods would cost you twice as much as an apple at, I don't know, Costco or a Walmart. So there is actually financial value in having more sustainable methods of agriculture. And guess what data reveals? Data reveals that India uses the least amount of pesticide and fertilizer out there. So there you go, Aditya and another idea for India to export.
See, see the apples in Whole Food definitely taste better than Walmart and Costco both. So
Sir, that I would not know. I can only afford Walmart level apples, so that is what I would know about.
no, better than that is in my farm in West Virginia we have natural apples there. So
Oh, wonderful.
so apple trees are very common in many parts of Virginia, West Virginia, very common, and the natural apples are smaller, not bigger. Like see the
Okay.
Costco apples are huge red, and you by
Yes.
looking at the shape only these are artificially produced, and the real apples will be smaller size and will have little more flavor, little more tangy flavor, you can call it tangy. Now coming to again the technology aspect and the growth. See the technology in governance today, you see Twitter passing a foreign policy statement against Uganda. So
Mhm.
I'm seeing that the big tech is, and I'm myself technologist, so I don't want to go against anyone, but I'm talking about technology for lok sangraha, for the benefit of all, not for the benefit of a few. Now, now when you say this big tech role is going to get prominence in India in 22 elections and 24 elections, the way the big tech has influenced the elections, now they just Twitter passed a statement, very hypocritical statement, saying that the Ugandan elections are not free and fair. It used to be the work of the State Department of the US, but the Twitter is being used so much it is influencing the election over there, and it is also going to influence in a big time in India also. So, do you think anytime in the future, Indian government might come up with their own Twitter or public platforms? Because depending on these American ones is even Americans can't depend on them. They're deplatformizing Americans also, including the sitting president of the United States.
Well, you see, it's a very important question, Aditya ji. It's to me, it's a very, very basic ideological question. Do the people regulate social media, or does social media regulate people? This is a question. This is literally the only question that needs to be answered today. Um, you know, Again, using an Indian context or an Ugandan context or whatever it is, the bottom line is no business or platform or publisher or whatever has the permission to take away rights that are constitutionally guaranteed to you. For example, let's take India, US, etc., sovereign countries. Um, no corporation should have the right to interfere in a sovereign process. Elections, democratic processes, exactly, etc., are sovereign processes. And like Twitter found out the hard way in Uganda, if they do try and interfere with those processes, If a Twitter wants to decide that you can speak and I can't, then at some point there will be some kind of pushback or a ricochet effect to that, as there should be. If banks are regulated, if hospitals are regulated, if food manufacturing companies are regulated, why shouldn't big tech be regulated, right? And I know they've pushed back hard on this, but I don't think that party is going to last. Now, to your second question, should India have an alternative? I'd like to answer a slightly modified form of that question, which is, can India have an alternative? Sadly, I think the answer there is no, and that answer rests more in economics than it does in regulation or ideology. So Carl Shapiro and Hal Varian, who happen to be from your state, have done a lot of academic work on this. One of them has gone to now head economics at Google. On the other hand, you had Professor Stan Leibowitz at the University of Texas, who's also done some very interesting work on this. Now, the bottom line is the way network externalities work. Wherever there is a network externality, there is almost always a winner take all kind of a solution, which is to say, Twitter is meaningful on me if you are on Twitter, if A, B, C, D, E, F is on Twitter. Now, I might say, okay, let me go to Gab or this or that or whatever it is, but unless everybody else gets there, it is pointless for me. So unfortunately, and if you're interested in this, there's a there's an hour-long discussion I've done where I've really gone into depth. See, it's very patriotic and nationalistic and woke to say, India should have its own Twitter, and Modi ji should move on to this, and blah 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 blah. Fact is, realistically speaking, from an economic principles perspective, India cannot have its own version of Twitter till Twitter exists. Period. Right. Reality is, just from a human psychology point of view, half the people go on Twitter to have fights with the other person. Right. आपको राणा यूब से झगड़ा करना है, आपको बरखा दत्त से झगड़ा करना है, आपको शेखर गुप्ता से झगड़ा करना है. If a Barkha Dutt or a Rana Ayub or a Shekhar Gupta are not on whatever alternative, why the hell would you go there, right? I'm just giving you a semi-facetious example, right? If you're interested in details, there's an hour-long discussion I had with Kushal Mehra on this, which is available on the Charvaka podcast channel. So Kushal Mehra's Charvaka podcast channel. Bottom line, I do not think India can have an alternative unless India does what China did, which is to say, if you're not playing by our rules, if you're going to hinder with our freedom of speech, if you're going to take away our people's constitutional rights, if you're not going to clarify if you're a publisher or a platform, then sorry, there's no space for you in India because you're not complying with our regulations the way Uganda did. And sadly, India has not been taking very hard steps, right? Our Prime Minister invites, you see, I mean, I'll tell you the kind of things that disturb me, right? From an India, if let's say, if a Mukesh Ambani or a Ratan Tata or a whoever goes to Washington, I don't expect a Donald Trump to give him a one-to-one meeting, right? But when a Jack Dorsey comes to India, our Prime Minister does give him a one-on-one meeting, right? And then he quickly steps out of that meeting to go and bash Brahmins in India. So you see, I think sadly we've not really used our might or conveyed our might to big tech. I hope that changes. I mean, unless that changes, you should expect some very, very strong interference, like it's been happening in Uganda, like it's been happening in the US recently as well.
See, again, the India misuses the Atithi Devo Bhava concept tremendously, which is, Atithi is someone who has good intentions, not bad intentions.
Absolutely.
The bad intention guest has to be treated as an enemy, not as an Atithi.
Yeah.
But you brought us to a very good point here. The leadership, how do you see the aspirations of Indian society is historical. They were great, and due to foreign influence, they became poor. But an aspiration you cannot kill. it's in the genes because they have seen the world, and the West doesn't know that because, see, if you compare US with India, then it is four times the population of the US, or three times more the population, or four actually would multiply by four. And the livable area of US is just 25%. So if you look at the livable area in the US, and the whole Indian India is livable area. So in terms of area, both areas are the same, but the disproportionate military in the US is actually guiding the terms to India, because they know if they do not comply, they lose an ally, which can help them in their local regional politics. India has enemies on every part of the border. South is the ocean, but north and east, sorry, west, and some parts of east also turning like that. So the so where does the role of Indian military play in building up this confidence level of Indian?
You see, boss, I'll give you a slightly different answer to this, right? Today, we're talking about military, we're talking about aggression, we're talking about conflict um, in isolation to economic realities. Fact is, you see, China as a market is not open for anybody to explore. India as a market is the only large opportunity that exists for the Western world. It could be the US, the UK, wherever it is. As of last year, India also replaced the UK as the fifth largest economy in the world. Now, uh, why? So I understand what you're saying. The military industrial complex and DARPA and all of that are far more evolved in the US. But the fact is, going forward, the US as a nation does need the Indian market to prosper, right? And why does it need it? Because the US themselves are going through a huge challenge or a huge crisis in terms of domestic consumption. To answer your question, the you cannot take an isolated view of military might without taking the view of economic might, which is where India is emerging at a very very serious level. Coming down to economic might, you see, for the last 60, 70 years, a country like India has had to deal with depravity. We have had to deal with very basic subsistence issues, poverty, education, healthcare, infant mortality, things like that. It's only but despite all of that, Indians as a people haven't lost their spirit. Right? If you talk to an average Indian, it doesn't matter if they're poor, it doesn't matter if they're hungry or whatever it is. They still have a sense of humor. They still have a sense of pride. They still have a sense of aspiration. They still have a sense of confidence. And we should not underestimate what that collective positivity means in terms of the strength of a nation. I just posted on LinkedIn, I think yesterday, a very interesting graph which shows, and this is for the US, that what are, depending on when you were born, 1940, 1950, 1960, 1970, what are the chances that you were more prosperous than your parents? For people born in 1960 and after, the table has inverted, right? Now think about what that means for a second, right? It's what is called the hinge of history nowadays. The assumption across history, across every society, every family, every individual, right? If you have children, you assume that your children will be more prosperous than you. You assume that they'll be happier than you. You assume that they will have better things than you do. However, that has taken a U-turn in the US starting people born 1960. Now imagine what that means going forward to the psyche of Americans, right? Where, we are the first, our generation of Americans are the first generation that are not as relatively prosperous as their parents were. For them to know that it's going to get worse for their children, right? What does that mean in terms of what their individual or collective ethos is like? What does that mean in terms of what the what the psychological strength of a society or a nation becomes. Fine, you'll always have some corporates in the Silicon Valley. You'll have some, startups here and there. You'll have some manufacturing in Chicago, some banks in New York who'll be doing great. But the bulk of America is dealing with defeatism in their personal lives, right? Uh, so beyond the point, it doesn't matter what kind of missiles and technology you have. Of course, I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but the inherent collective strength in peoples is what will drive geopolitical balances, I'm sure, in the future.
Thank you, Anuragji, for a wonderful time here. And just one point I'll say in the history, if you look at it, even from ancient Indian scriptures, also that Arjun is called Dhananjay because he was able to bring law and order in other places where they did not exist, and that's how
Yeah.
they grew their wealth. And America has been prosperous after World War II. Before World War II, there was a Great Depression, and they had the worst scenarios there. And never in the history of the United States, other than last 4 years, US did not initiate a war. And now that culture is going to come back. So America will become financially, or they will get more financial resources through their foreign policy, which is based on intervention, military intervention. And that's how they have always done their business. And that's how Germany became rich and that's how this is the history of the world. And Soviet Union was rich because of the same philosophy. Chinese are using that philosophy in a big way. But the problem with the Chinese is, first of all, they don't understand other people's mindset. That is the biggest problem they're having, and that's why they are not able to succeed. So that is a historical fact. Do you think we can ignore that? There is a historical, it's history everywhere.
You see, so very interestingly, people that study military conflict have divided four eras of warfare. The first era was man to man combat. The second era was where we started using weapons, where we realized that I could hit you with a stick and you could poke me with a spear. Right. The third is where we started fighting as groups, where we started congregating that, okay, here are my 100 people, there are your 100 people, we'll try and beat each other up. The fourth era has been um, conflicts where you harm non combatants, right? America, as an example, has used that as their strength, right? So dropping the bombs, the nuclear bombs, for example, in Japan, um, was a was a show that, listen, it is not just people in the front lines who will suffer, right? That's how they broke the spirit of a nation, to say that it didn't you don't need to be in the military or the navy or the air force, uh, for you to die in conflict. You could just die in conflict by voting in a government that wants to protect itself, that wants to invest in military, etc. Now those four eras of warfare are done and dusted. The next era of warfare, in my opinion, is it's going to be very difficult for the world, uh, for nations to become very overtly expansionist, right? So what we used to see of people trying to push their border a little bit into, their neighbor, the neighboring country, I think that's kind of going to go away. Also because of international sanctions, because of political correctness, because of platforms like the United Nations, which may or may not be effective, but they're at least there, right? So I kind of have a very different view that overt aggression is dead or dying. More rudimentary nations in the Middle East, etc., will keep trying that, but that's fine. Um, what we should be scared about more is the war of narratives, because that's something. For example, China has invested really, really well there. America has naturally invested well there because of their capitalist models, with the way the news industry, digital media, etc., gets funded. So I think we should be worried about the war of narratives. We should be worried about biochemical kind of warfare, and that's going to be the next era. I do not. Well, at least I. I hope I'm right on this. I don't see, feet on the ground, missiles and nuclear bombs being dropped on others as sustainable strategy. Let's hope we never have to see that era again.
Thank you, Anurag ji, for your time, and thank you, viewers, for staying long and seeing it live here. Uh, it is always a pleasure speaking with you. Wealth of
This is
knowledge and
this is
research.
it's almost the middle of the night, and I feel totally energized speaking with you, Aditya.
We'll do more. I'll wake
Absolutely.
you up, keep you awake more weeks.
Super happy to.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Namaskar.